if you spend any time online at all and you have any amount of discernment and you take the time to read and think, I think it's inescapable that you will observe that a lot of people don't really know how to read or don't seem to care about reading. When I say reading, I don't just mean reading the words, right? Like that's quote unquote easy, and the issue is always that people know how to read individual words and then they think they know what those words mean. And how do you teach literacy to people, right? And all kinds of media literacy. It's not just text, right? It's like, my secondary school English teacher would say that everything is a text, right? Like we live in a world made of text, and videos are texts, and contexts are texts, right? And like, how do you teach people to study texts and to evaluate texts? And it's a very involved job. I don't know if it's possible to do it over video, because you really need to get to know a person and see where they're coming from, and because you want to understand their interpretations in order to, so whether or not it's a misinterpretation, right? All interpretations are going to be misinterpretations to some degree, and misunderstanding is the default state, and people don't understand this because misunderstanding is the default state, right? So like, if we are to begin to have any kind of communication at all with anyone in a meaningful way, we have to understand the nature of communication. And I mean, but communication happens all the time, and people don't necessarily have like elaborate theories of how communication works, but they have models in their heads of how it works, and they don't really question these models that much unless something happens that, and it's a very hero's journey kind of thing, right? Something happens that pulls you out of the ordinary world. You had some belief about, my friends don't talk behind my back about me, right? Or something like that. Or I can always trust this person to mean what they say. Or, so and so will never manipulate me or lie to me. And all manner of things. Not necessarily such malicious events, but just that what is not as it seems, is something like, so we are born to assuming, it seems to me that we are born assuming that it is as it seems, right? What you see is what there is, and experience will teach you inevitably, I think, that things are not necessarily as they seem, and people don't necessarily mean what they say. They don't necessarily even know what they mean by what they say, right? And if they don't know what they really think, they will say things, and they need to be given, the context to examine what they say and restate what they say, and so on. And that requires patience. It requires a kind of kindness, really, trust, good faith, time. So to get to know anything or anybody, right, it takes patience, it takes kindness, a willingness to make mistakes, because you will make mistakes. How are you not going to make mistakes in interpretation, right? And if we want to make the world a better place in the broadest sense, any kind of endeavor that anybody is going to pursue past some threshold is going to involve interfacing with other people, and that involves communication, and communication is lossy, and people don't necessarily understand that, and misunderstanding is the default condition, and people don't necessarily understand that either. So if I do nothing else with my life but help people understand that communications is lossy and misunderstanding is the default state, and that things are not necessarily as they seem, and what we see is not necessarily what is there, that would be a good life, and I would be satisfied, I think, doing that with my life. I have more things I want to do, but like, doing that well, I think would be a good way to spend one's life, right? Because it's the rising tide that raises all the boats. If people can understand each other better. And here I'm reminded again of so I already quoted Bertrand Russell there when I alluded to everything is vague to a degree we do not realize it's precise. everything is vague to a degree we do not realize until we attempt to make it precise. And everything precise is so remote from what we ordinarily think that we should not assume for a second that we mean what we say when we say what we think. Something like that. So I'm fudging the quote a little bit. I'll post it in the description maybe. But that's Bertrand Russell's perspective, which is really, you can sit with that quote and have a kind of revelation when you realize that everything you've ever said is an approximation, right? And everything you've ever read is an approximation. And like the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao, right? And other than, so that's the Bertrand half of it. The other half of it is the Orwell half of it. And Orwell's point of view, which was during wartime, but you know, we live in, there are wars going on, right? And McLuhan said that, I don't know what, something, World War III will be, you know, no demarcation between civilians and war fighters or whatever. Like it will be an information war fought in the minds of civilians and so on. And yeah, so why did I bring up Orwell? Oh, his perspective was that, what was Orwell's perspective? Language can be degraded, right? So language is another thing alongside the nature of understanding and perception and media. Language is, you know, it's not fixed. Nothing is really fixed, you know. So language is dynamic, it's adaptive. Different people mean different things when they use the same words, and that is a cause of major misunderstanding. And the meaning of words shift over time. They get renegotiated. They have different connotations, different associations. There are words that mean the exact opposite of the thing that they used to mean, right? One of the funny example of this is the word Nimrod used to mean like a great hunter, I think, from biblical context, or a great warrior or some kind. And it was used to mock Elmer Fudd, I think, in Looney Tunes. And since the name itself kind of sounds funny, people now associate Nimrod with Elmer Fudd's incompetence. And so, like, it's flipped. And there are many such cases, right? Like, what does it mean to be dispassionate? Does it mean disinterested? There's a bunch of, you know, words that have... So the word literally is used figuratively. So literally also means not literally. And that is the conundrum of language. You can't change that. You can't change the fact that people want to use hyperbole. You can't change the fact that people want to mess with language. And those are like innocuous, you know, cutesy, fun kind of things. But like Orwell's concern was that during wartime, for example, like propaganda will dilute the meaning of words. And that makes it harder for people to know what's going on. And when words have diluted meaning, it's hard for anybody to say anything that makes sense. So that's a concern, right? What else? So yeah, if we want people to be able to make sense to each other, they have to almost reinvent language or re-knit language. They have to be thoughtful and purposeful in the words that they use. And you typically need some small cluster of people to be very careful with their words. And the interesting thing there is that you can actually make the world, quote unquote, a better place by just being careful with your words, being thoughtful with your words, by meaning what you say. Taking the trouble to be careful to mean what you say is a public service. It really is. And yeah, you know, so in some senses, this doesn't need to be said, but I want to say it, so I'm saying it. And I don't know whether it's going to make it into an essay, but it's part of a complex, a part of a tree structure of ideas that I have that I'm trying to piece together into a series of essays potentially. Yeah, it's language, misunderstanding, communication. What I eventually want to get to is wretchedness. I'm very excited about reintroducing the idea of wretchedness. Excited. I think it will be a good thing to do. Right? And should I talk about it in this essay, this video? Just really quickly, I guess, before I end it. So in the song Amazing Grace, it said, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, to save a wretch like me. I once was lost and now I'm found, once was blind but now I see. A wretch like me, W-R-E-T-C-H. I think that word is useful and it's underutilized. And I think these days we use words like incel, for example. I think it's a terrible word that people should not use. And let me explain it. The word comes from involuntary celibacy as a phrase, and it implies that the problem with a person who identifies or is identified as an incel is that they're not having sex. And that's not really the problem. The problem is this neediness and the assumptions that they have around sex and what it means to be a person who has or does not have sex. And it's just using the word incel, I feel, makes the problem worse. There's a whole bunch of phrases like this. Imposter syndrome is another one. I think that in trying to describe a problem, it makes it worse. I might feel the same way about ADHD potentially, which is like, it feels like a blasphemous thing to say, right? Like you're questioning mainstream, what now feels like mainstream dogma. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. I'm saying that the framing perpetuates the problem. Some framings perpetuate the problems that they frame. And I think I've been very anxious and nervous to even begin talking about this because it makes it sound like I'm saying that problems are people's fault. I'm not saying that. I think that's a very simplistic way of thinking about it. And actually I think I'm gonna go home with that thought and maybe I'll write an essay about that. Done.